Hello, and welcome back to the World of Wysteria. This afternoon, I will be reading Chapter 13, and this will be presented in two parts. Wysteria, Chapter 13. According to the clock on the tower, and confirmed by the lengthening shadows, it was now past 6:30. "Do you mind if we sit for a while?" Will asked. "Not at all," Emily replied. "Let's go down to the garden," he said. "There's something I want to show you." Barring something unforeseen, such as the sun and time suddenly coming to a halt, the sky would soon darken, and Emily would witness the first surprise he had in store for her. They left the square and walked down to the garden. Once inside its doors, Will led Emily to the same bench on which he'd sat the night before. "What is it you wanted me to see?" she asked, as they both took a seat facing west. "Did you add something to the garden?" The sun was now turning a deeper shade of orange as it moved closer to the horizon. "Well, in a sense, I suppose," he said. Will had considered different ways of revealing the surprise, of presenting his gift to her, but in the end, he decided to say nothing and allow her to realize what was happening. However, it would be difficult to talk to Emily about any of the subjects that were on his mind without referring to the sunset and the string of events that would follow. "Actually," he continued, "I added something new to the whole world, a new dimension." "A new dimension? What do you mean?" she asked. Will thought for a moment about how to answer. Before long, Emily would have to notice that the sun was disappearing, so he thought it safe to begin discussing the subject of time in a general way. "While I was planning the festival," he began, "I started thinking about time, that it passes at a different speed here, that time is so compressed compared to how it passes in the waking world." "Yes, it's a strange phenomenon," said Emily, "but it's wonderful that it works that way rather than the other way around. Otherwise, we wouldn't have much of a life here." It then occurred to Will that he'd never given much thought to the question of why time passed so slowly in dreams. "Is there a reason it works that way?" he asked. "Jeremy tried to explain it to me," she said. "A lot of it went over my head, but it has something to do with relativity theory as it relates to time. Do you know what I'm talking about?" "Yes, the basic concept at least," Will replied. "According to Einstein's theory, time is relative. Time and space are interconnected, and the faster something moves through space, the slower it moves through time." Emily laughed. "I wish Jeremy could have explained it so concisely," she said. "You obviously understand the subject better than I do. And to tell you the truth, you just answered your own question." "What do you mean?" he asked. "According to Jeremy," she said, "time moves at a different speed when we're dreaming because we move at a different speed. Does that make sense?" "Well," he replied, giving it some thought, "not really. Wouldn't that produce the opposite effect?" "How so?" The classic example used to illustrate the theory involves a pair of identical twins, he said. One of them takes a trip on a spaceship traveling very close to the speed of light, while the other stays on Earth. 20 years later, by Earth time, the spaceship returns, and though the Earthbound twin is 20 years older, as you'd expect, his astronaut brother has aged only a few minutes. Time was moving more slowly for him because he was traveling so fast. It's not the aging process that slows down, it's time itself. A clock on the spaceship would show that only a few minutes had passed, and that's what the passenger on board would have experienced, that he'd been gone only a few minutes, not 20 years. So, he said, coming to his point, if it's true that when we dream, our speed changes and we move faster, then, just like the astronaut twin, time would slow down and our dreams would seem shorter than the clocks at home had measured. But that's not what happens. It's the other way around. It feels like our dreams are longer. Emily took a moment to think, then smiled. Your reasoning, as usual, is sound, she replied. But there's something you're missing. She paused, giving him an opportunity to catch his error before she continued. Think about it, Will. Which he did, but to no avail. The logic seemed pretty straightforward to him. I'm sorry, he said. I don't see it. You're assuming that we move faster when we dream, said Emily, revealing the faulty premise in his argument. But we don't. We move slower. Slower? How is that possible? Will asked her. When we're in our beds at home, our bodies aren't moving at all. How can anything move slower than that? Slower than zero? It has something to do with the frequency of our minds when we dream, she replied. I only know that you move slower when you're dreaming, so more things happen in a shorter period of time. Jeremy made that point very clear. And that's all he had to say about it? He asked. Oh no, she said, breaking into laughter. He had a lot to say on the subject. I just couldn't follow most of it. Having a conversation with Jeremy, when he's in the mood to chat, is always challenging, if not totally confusing. It's easy to get lost, especially since he tends to keep changing the subject, without letting you know he's done that, of course. But I do remember him saying that we're never actually at rest in the waking world, and that the speed you call zero isn't really zero. In fact, according to Jeremy, it's not even close. It's like the difference between 0 degrees Celsius and absolute zero, as it's called. We're not at total rest when we're dreaming either, but we're moving much slower than we move in the waking world. Slower through space and, therefore, faster through time. Will took a minute to think it through. As crazy as it sounded, the explanation made perfect sense, as long as one accepted the premise that there was such a thing as negative speed. Does this have something to do with the new dimension you wanted to show me? Emily asked. Not really, he said, realizing how far off the subject they'd gotten, and in such a short time. Although there is a connection. In order to create this new modification, I needed a way to measure the passing of time, here in Wysteria. So, the clock tower in the square, Emily jumped in. That's why you made it. Yes. And it works, she asked. It measures dream time. It seems to, he replied, glancing over at the sun, which was now nearly touching the tops of the trees in the distance. But there's more to it than that. Will was surprised that Emily still hadn't noticed what was taking place right in front of her eyes. He was growing impatient and decided to give her a hint. What does a clock measure, Emily, besides how much time has passed between events? I'm not sure what you mean, she said. Put it this way. A clock might tell us that an hour has gone by since we've been sitting here, but it also indicates what time it is. Well, obviously, Will, but I still don't see what you're getting at. Okay, he said, laughing. Let me put it another way. It tells us what time of day it is. Yes, that's certainly true in the waking world, she conceded. But the time of day isn't just a matter of hands on a clock pointing to some numbers. It's determined where we are in a certain cycle. It's determined by where the... Emily turned her head, locked her eyes on the sun, then shot up from her seat. Oh my God, Will, the sunset. Will stood and put his arm around her. Finally, he said, kissing the side of her head. She slid her arm around his waist and laid her head against his shoulder. They stood this way, side by side, watching the sun spread a stunning display of color across the sky until it slipped below the horizon. As night dawned on Wysteria, they sat back down, and Will began telling her the full story of his elaborate scheme. Emily listened quietly until he started explaining how he'd managed to start the clock on the tower, whereupon he pulled out his pocket watch. Where did you get that? She asked, staring at the anachronistic timepiece. I brought it from home, he said, handing it to her. It was my father's. You brought it with you? She said, examining it closely, handling it with care, as if the object were something totally foreign to her. Yes, he replied. You see, I wondered what would happen if... You shouldn't be able to do that, Will, she said, abruptly cutting him off. Do what? Bring things here from the waking world. I mean, it can be done, but... Well, it's not really the same watch that I have back home, is it? He said. I'm sure the real watch is still there, just like the clothes I'm wearing, and my body, for that matter. Why is this any different? It just is, Emily told him. You arrive here with your clothes because that's how you see yourself. You're so used to being in clothes that they're like a second skin. They're part of your identity. Usually, people show up wearing the clothes they wore that day, or the clothes that they usually wear. But that's the strongest image. But that's because that's the strongest image they have of themselves. Sometimes a person can choose to wear something different, she continued. But that takes some practice, and it doesn't always work. So, a nudist would show up naked, I assume, he said with a grin. Probably so, Will, she said, playfully pinching his arm. But seriously, I don't think you realize how strange this is. How did you do it? frankly. I just put it in my pocket, he replied. Will then went on to describe how the watch and the clock tower had behaved, how resetting the watch seemed to jumpstart both the clock and the square and the movement of the sun. Wow, said Emily. I don't know what to say, except that you've accomplished something remarkable. It's beyond me, I'm afraid. When the sun's ambient glow had disappeared and faint stars began sparkling overhead, Will noticed new shadows beginning to form in front of him. There's one more thing I have to show you before we go back to the square, he said. Another surprise? She asked. Yes, for both of us. Then, taking her hand, Will stood up, as did she. Now, turn around, he said. Together, they turned and faced east, where they were met with another dazzling celestial sight, an enormous full moon hovering on the horizon. Oh, Will, she gasped. It's just gorgeous. The moon that now rose in Wysteria was far more striking than its earthly counterpart, casting a pure, soft, white light shimmering with silvery highlights. Not only was his moon many times larger, it also appeared to be much closer. I wasn't expecting it to be so big, he remarked, scanning the details of its cratered surface. It's quite dramatic. So, this is the first time you've seen it, she asked. Yes, he said. I watched the sun set last night, but this was still in the works. I wanted us to see it rise together, because it's my gift to you. It's your moon, Emily. Mine, she said, hugging his arm. Really? Yes, it's yours, he told her, adding with a smile, but it has to stay here. You can't take it with you. Darn, Emily replied, giggling. I wanted to show all of my friends back home the wonderful present I got from my boyfriend. There was a slightly awkward pause. Though each had confessed feelings for the other, they'd never defined their relationship. I don't think you could fit it into your pocket, dear, he pointed out. No, I don't suppose I could, she said wistfully. But that's okay. It belongs here, with you. Just as she did, he thought. They stood a while longer, bathing in the moonlight. Then Will suggested they return to the plaza. There was still more to the festival. Yes, she said. I suppose I should look for Charlotte. Will had almost forgotten about their guest. I hope she hasn't been bored, he said. Don't worry. I'm sure she's been able to entertain herself, Emily replied with a soft chuckle. They then left the garden and walked up to the square, where they found the celebration still in full swing, now centered around an enormous bonfire blazing not far from the fountain. A group of musicians played a lively tune, while several dozen townsfolk danced in a circle around the flames. And there, in the midst of them, was Charlotte, dancing arm in arm with a young man. Found her, said Emily. Okay, and And we will continue shortly with the part 2 of chapter 13.